Most women are not loud when they leave. They grow quiet. Their laughter fades first, then the questions stop. And when they do speak, it's measured, vague, careful. You won't always know it's happening, but if you look closely, the silence begins long before the absence. This isn't cowardice. It's seduction in its most powerful form. Not the kind meant to draw you in, but the kind meant to remind you that you've already lost access. And the mystery of it all is where your obsession begins. What would you think if I told you that silence is not absence, but dominance? That for the high-value feminine archetype, silence isn't a retreat. It's a deliberate act, a soft sword, an exit wrapped in elegance. She knows the value of her presence. She knows the way men lean in to hear her laugh, the way her voice once softened tension in your shoulders. And so when she chooses silence, it is not because she has nothing to say, because you no longer deserve to hear it. This is not the silence of submission, it's the silence of standards. And most men will mistake it for moodiness, emotional instability, or mind games. But the man who sees clearly, who understands the Stoic framework of cause and response, knows otherwise. He recognizes silence not as a void, but as a verdict. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Her silence is an event. Your reaction is where the test begins. Because here's the truth, most men fail the moment she withdraws. They chase. They apologize for things they never did. They perform. They text paragraphs into a void that doesn't echo back. Not realizing every word sent into that silence only affirms their loss of frame. She watches, not with cruelty, but with clarity. She doesn't need to fight. She doesn't need to explain. Her silence does the work. There is a particular kind of woman who's been broken before, not destroyed, but remade. A woman who has learned to never hand over her voice to someone who doesn't know how to hold it. She once begged for clarity. Now she has clarity. And she knows that silence is the final act of a woman who has exhausted every effort to be understood. To the unconscious man, her silence will be maddening. He'll misread it as an opportunity to assert, fix, or rescue. He'll fill it with noise, misunderstanding its message. But to the Stoic man, to the emotionally evolved man, it is an initiation, an invitation not to react, but to reflect. What triggered the withdrawal? What energy shifted? Was it a lack of presence and over-reliance on charm, or simply the failure to see her beyond her softness? In a world where people scream for attention, the woman who chooses stillness is the most disarming. She leaves not by slamming doors, but by walking quietly through the ones she left open too many times for someone who never noticed it was hers to close. You must understand her silence is not passive. It's not a punishment. It's not a manipulation tactic. It is a sacred reclaiming of self. Seneca once wrote, "Sometimes even to live is an act of courage." For her, to be silent is an act of spiritual self-preservation. It's how she reclaims peace in a world that tried to make her explain herself to death. She will not beg. She will not repeat. She will not clarify for someone committed to misunderstanding her. And you, if you are wise, will not try to break that silence. You will sit with it. You will ask why it disturbs you. You will ask what it reveals. Because the woman who knows her worth doesn't use silence as a tactic, she uses it as a threshold, one you may no longer be invited to cross. Silence, for her, is not the absence of emotion, it is the presence of emotional discipline. It is the moment she chooses not to correct your misunderstanding, not to defend her softness, not to argue for her own dignity. Because if you didn't feel it when she spoke, you're not meant to hear it when she stops. This kind of silence isn't just seductive, it's sacred. And it terrifies men who equate love with access. You see, most men confuse availability with affection. They believe that if she's still responding, still explaining, still engaging, then she still cares. And when that engagement is gone, when her replies become rare, when her warmth disappears from the room, even though her body hasn't, they feel the ground shift beneath them. But here's the truth buried under centuries of wounded masculinity. She doesn't go silent to confuse you. She goes silent because she finally sees clearly. And in that clarity, she understands that not every man deserves the intimacy of her voice, that not every disappointment warrants a confrontation, that some things are too sacred to explain to someone who lacks the emotional language to understand them. In the space between what she feels and what she says, there is power, raw, radiant, grounded power. It is the opposite of begging. It is the death of performance. It is a woman standing still in the storm of your uncertainty, knowing she does not need to move towards you to prove her worth. This is what makes her silence seductive. Not because it's cold, but because it forces the world around her to pause, to wonder, to ask, what did I miss? Where did she go? Why can't I feel her anymore? Even when she's near, and it's in that wondering that men begin to remember what they took for granted. The feminine mystique is not in her curves, or her perfume, or her laugh. It's in her restraint. It's in her ability to walk away without asking you to follow. Marcus Aurelius taught that the wise man does not pursue pleasure, but pursues alignment with nature, with reason, with virtue. Likewise, the wise woman does not pursue validation. She returns to herself, choosing her peace over the performance of being likable. She no longer needs to be understood by those committed to shallow perception. Her silence is her answer, not to hurt, but to honor herself. And if you're a man who has witnessed that silence, you've been given a choice, not to win her back, not to decode the perfect apology, but to evolve, to reflect, to meet yourself in the mirror she left behind. Because in her absence, something remains, not the version of her that tolerated half love, but the echo of a boundary you never saw coming. This is the turning point, the crossroads where the Stoic man is forged in reflection, not reaction. A weak man will fill the space with noise-new women, empty pleasure, drunken distractions, status-chasing performances. He will mistake silence for emptiness and race to fill it with things that mean nothing. But a grounded man, he will sit, he will feel the weight of what was unspoken, and he will let that silence refine him. That's what makes a man unshakable. Not how he speaks when he's heard, but how he listens when she no longer speaks. Her silence does not beg to be broken, it begs to be understood. And until it is, she will remain a mystery you cannot possess, a story you cannot rewrite, a presence you cannot summon back with need. Because her seduction was never in how she touched you, but in how she taught you to sit with your own shadow the moment she withdrew her light. There is something ancient in a woman's silence, something that echoes across centuries of unspoken grief, of words swallowed out of survival, of truths dismissed as hysteria. So when she chooses silence today, in a world louder than ever, it is not emptiness. It is a revolution. And men who are not ready for that kind of woman will always call her distant. They will accuse her of playing games, of being emotionally unavailable, of lacking warmth. Because what they're truly facing is the discomfort of not being able to control the outcome. A woman in her power is not unpredictable. She is simply unwilling to explain herself to men who've never earned the right to witness her full self. She does not offer softness to avoid abandonment. She does not share pain just to be heard. She speaks when there is alignment, and when there isn't, she withdraws without cruelty, but with clarity. You may not notice it at first. It might begin with smaller things, less laughter in her messages, less curiosity in her questions, less warmth in her eyes. But then one day, you'll realize she stopped reaching out entirely. and suddenly her absence feels louder than all the words you ignored. This is when most men panic. And in their panic, they overcompensate with grand gestures, late apologies, promises soaked in desperation. But what they fail to grasp is this: the feminine doesn't respond to desperation. It responds to depth. And nothing is deeper than a man who knows how to sit with discomfort without needing to fix it. A man who understands that her silence is not an invitation to chase, but a signal to reflect. To remember that silence is not rejection. It is revelation. Seneca once said, "No man is more unhappy than he who never faces adversity, for he is not permitted to prove himself." And there is no greater adversity for a reactive man than a woman who refuses to engage his chaos. She doesn't argue. She doesn't block. She doesn't explain her absence in 3 paragraphs of emotional closure. She just stops showing up, not to wound you, but to rescue herself. You see, many women have spent years over-explaining their value, trying to be palatable, digestible, sweet enough to stay, strong enough to hold a man's projection, quiet enough to not threaten his ego, open enough to remain low maintenance. But those days are dying, because the modern feminine is returning to her ancient memory, the one where she remembered that stillness is not submission. It is strategy. She's no longer seeking peace through pleasing. She's choosing peace by pruning. And in her silence, she trims away every connection that cannot hold the weight of her becoming. The Stoic man doesn't flinch when this happens. He recognizes the sacred nature of detachment. He doesn't chase what's leaving, he examines why it had to leave. He steps back, not to manipulate, but to witness, to honor what was, without trying to resurrect what no longer serves. He understands that when a woman goes silent, what dies is not just the connection, but the illusion that she would stay forever without being fully seen. And in that realization, the Stoic man finds something deeper than longing. He finds stillness. A stillness that doesn't resist the loss, but allows it to refine his presence. Because ultimately, her silence was never a punishment. It was an oracle, a mirror. And when he learns to sit with it, not as rejection, but as instruction, he becomes the man who no longer fears silence, because he no longer fears himself. Some men will spend years haunted by a silence they never understood. They will replay her last words, search for signals in her final glance, misinterpret her stillness as disinterest when in truth it was disappointment too deep for words. They will tell their friends she ghosted them, that she became cold, that she just changed. But what they won't say, because they can't admit it even to themselves, is that she tried. She softened first. She stayed longer than her intuition advised. She gave him chances, grace, unspoken forgiveness. And when all of it went unseen, she chose silence, because to speak again would be self-betrayal. The feminine, in its highest form, does not explain itself to those who refuse to see. It does not scream to be valued. It does not repeat lessons already ignored. It withdraws, reclaims, and waits not for him to return, but for her own center to come back into alignment. This is the part most men never witness. The private ceremony of her own rebirth. In the space where he thought she was waiting, she is actually rebuilding. No longer the woman who tolerated confusion. No longer the girl who thought her silence was powerlessness. Now, she wears it like armor, not to defend against love, but to filter who is truly capable of holding it. And that's what seduces the man who is watching too late, not her body, not her smile, not her photos he scrolls through months after she's gone, but the realization that she doesn't need to return. Her detachment isn't fake. It's not a performance. It's the result of a spiritual calibration, of choosing peace, not pettiness, of building inner stillness so sacred that chaos can no longer seduce her. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul. And so it is with her. She retreats not to punish, but to protect the sanctuary she fought to rebuild. She no longer hands out keys to men who confuse her softness for surrender. She is not angry. She is simply unavailable to those who arrive too late. The masculine will always be tempted to fight silence with noise, but the mature masculine learns to meet silence with stillness, to not demand answers, but to sit with the discomfort of the unknown. And in that discomfort, he begins to hear something deeper, not her words, but his own unhealed echoes bouncing back. Because her silence doesn't just reveal her strength, it reveals his gap, his emotional vocabulary, his inner fractures, the places where he confused attention with affection and reassurance with connection. The Stoic man doesn't crumble here. He doesn't run to distractions. He faces it alone, deliberately, without begging for a resolution that's no longer his to request. He begins to see her not as a mystery to decode, but as a boundary he didn't honor. And in that quiet reckoning, he discovers the truth he was too loud to hear before, that the feminine doesn't abandon, she releases. And once she releases, she does not reopen. He may ache, he may remember, but he will not possess. And that is her seduction, to leave a man not broken, but awakened. To not make him chase, but make him reflect. To not punish him with silence, but initiate him through it. Because she was never trying to be unforgettable. She was simply trying to be understood. She was not made to echo the noise of a world that never learned to listen. She was made to be felt in the spaces where words run dry, where the masks fall, where presence becomes the only currency that matters. And when she withdrew quietly, finally, it was not to disappear. It was to return to herself, to step back into the sacred terrain of self-respect, where love is not begged for, and softness is no longer confused with access. Her silence was not an ending. It was a threshold. The man who walks through it unchanged will forget her name in time, but the man who sits with it, who lets it burn through his illusions, who allows it to rupture the boy inside, who demanded to be soothed, that man will not forget. Because her silence didn't break him. It broke open the parts of him still desperate for validation, for dominance masked as desire, for approval disguised as love. And when he sheds those layers, what's left is not bitterness, but stillness. He begins to understand that love without depth is noise, that attention without presence is starvation, that a woman's silence, when born from dignity, is the most devastating kind of clarity. Seneca once said, "He who is brave is free," and in her silence, she is the bravest of all. She is not afraid to be misunderstood. She is not afraid to be alone, because she has met herself so many times in that quiet. She no longer fears the absence of others. The mature feminine doesn't need to punish. She doesn't need to prove. She simply stops participating in anything that costs her peace. And in doing so, she becomes a mirror not of him, but of who he has yet to become. There is no script for how to win her back, because the point was never about getting her again. It was about learning who you were when she stopped clapping for the performance. This is where rebirth begins. Not in conquest, but in surrender. Not in getting her back, but in becoming the kind of man who no longer loses women like her. A man who honors silence as a teacher, who listens for what was never said, who understands that seduction is not always in the curve of a body, but in the curve of restraint, in the pause, in the way a woman withholds what was once freely given, not to wound, but to wake him. And when he rises from that awakening, he doesn't seek revenge, he doesn't drown in guilt. He simply steps forward cleaner, clearer, quieter, because he finally knows you do not beg for the feminine. You rise to meet it, or you lose it in silence. And she doesn't chase. She doesn't return to confusion. She doesn't perform for crumbs. She chooses. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.